At the center of today's Velshi Band Book Club feature is an eerily plausible alternate reality, a world as similar to our own as it is different. Philip K. Dick's award-winning 64-year-old science fiction classic, The Man in the High Castle. It explores the sort of what-if question that plagues the imagination of anyone who's ever thought critically about our history books, our involvement in war, our past, and what it all might mean for our present. The Man in the High Castle asks what would have happened if, in 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was successfully assassinated at a rally in Florida. Philip K. Dick's answer is an equally likely and catastrophic domino effect, a shift in political control. The New Deal is effectively reversed. The U.S. never fully recovers from the Great Depression and turns inward, more isolationist, and never joins the Allied forces in World War II. The Axis powers win. Fascism wins. Evil triumphs. The Man in the High Castle begins over a decade after the end of World War II. The United States is split between the Nazi-ruled American Reich in the east and the Japanese-occupied Pacific states of America to the west. There is enslavement, corruption, and censorship. The war is distant enough so that life, culture, and society have settled into the unstable and violent rhythm of fascism, but the war still exists in the present as a defining specter. The story is told to us through a number of intertwined narratives, primarily following three characters: the owner of a pre-war Americana antique shop, a skilled metal worker who hides the fact that he's Jewish, and a devout Buddhist who is a high-ranking Japanese trade official. The growth of these characters is driven by the existence of a banned book called The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. The book, which is a story within a story, is an alternative history where the Allied powers did win World War II. Crucially, though, The Grasshopper Lies Heavy doesn't tell the story of our real world off the page. It's actually a mirror realm, yet a third potential outcome of World War II. It's important to understand that The Man in the High Castle is not something you read for cheap thrills. The novel is, of course, interesting because of its conceit, its world building, its science fiction aspects. But it's a classic because of Dick's ability to capture psychological depth, his pulpy meets intellectual writing style, his humor, and how heavily researched the novel is. Jonathan Lethem, author and editor of a compilation of Dick's most famous work, says, quote, "The Man in the High Castle is also a work of extraordinarily passionate and scrupulous scholarship. This is not the daydream of someone who's just wondered, what if the Nazis won the war? All of the minor Nazi characters are thoroughly researched. Dick has written this almost scholarly alternate reality." Now, devotees of the late Philip K. Dick are happy to describe his novels, including The Man in the High Castle, as weird. And it's a compliment. Dick thrives in the metaphysical and the psychological. Aside from The Man in the High Castle, Dick wrote many books that served as source material for many culturally defining movies like The Blade Runner, Total Recall, and Majority Report. The breadth of Dick's work, including Man in the High Castle, explores what it means to be human and the increasingly relevant question of what defines our reality. The Man in the High Castle, though, asks something more. It asks what humanity, morality, and creativity look like in the face of evil. Here, Dick explores the complicity of living a normal life under fascism. He forces the reader to evaluate whether living a good life, one where change for the greater good is not the objective, is morally acceptable. He asks the reader to consider what they would do when the evils of fascism become present once again. And to read this novel today is to recognize that that day isn't coming, it's already here. Joining me now to discuss The Man in the High Castle by the late Philip K. Dick is Jonathan Lethem. He's an essayist, a short story writer, and the author of numerous novels, including The Fortress of Solitude. Lethem edited a compilation of Dick's most famous works called Philip K. Dick, 4 Novels of the 1960s. Jonathan, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Tell me about that. I'm trying to give a setup that explains, if people haven't read, and I know from my social media, a lot of our viewers have read and are very familiar with Philip K. Dick's work, but it's a complicated story to tell.
It's a complicated story to tell because, at one hand, it's a very plausible and lucid alternate history. And at the same time, it launches a kind of metaphysical conundrum, as you say, where there's a book within the book that people are reading which points to other possibilities. And this means that their reality is kind of slipping away, very typical for Philip K. Dick, slipping away as they try to grasp it. And I think the magic of this book is that it somehow does both things so well.
Right.
That it's, he was obsessed with the history of 20th century fascism, the portrait of the German kind of technocratic management of a colonized U.S. is extraordinarily detailed and gripping. And at the same time, he's asking you to experience a kind of vertigo where you see the U.S. turned inside out.
Yeah.
And I think it invites, it doubles on itself. It invites the opposite. It allows you to think, well, what if I'm reading the present wrong? What if in some weird way we did lose to fascism?
Imagine that.
At a metaphysical level.
Yeah.
Now, this goes, you have to think of Dick writing at this moment, which is, the post-war consensus, the height of technocratic optimism and triumphant.
Fascism had, in theory, been defeated.
It had been reduced to what? Colonel Klink on television. It was laughable, it was comic evil, and we had completely triumphed. And yet there were voices. I mean, if you think of Stanley Kubrick presenting Dr. Strangelove, or the great Tom Lehrer song, Werner von Braun, reminding us that we'd made a partnership with Nazi science, with Nazi corporatism, and that in some sense there was a deep level at which, by absorbing the militaristic and authoritarian, centralized, world-dominating perspective of fascism, we had, if not surrendered to it, we'd partnered with it, and that it was lurking under the skin of American reality. This is, something more than just pointing to the Japanese internment camps or the fact that we'd had, fascist rallies at Madison Square Garden. It's saying, in some way, even the victory over Germany and Japan meant that we'd incorporated aspects of this nightmarish possibility into our own forms of social control.
One of the things about this particular book, Man in the High Castle, but really all of Philip K. Dick's work that you comment on, is that it's super textured. It's super detailed. It's not, as you said, the casual musings of what if the Nazis had won. He really creates a world.
Well, and part of that texture is the specificity of the imperial command of the new Nazi leadership of the East Coast of the United States. What he does is so scrupulously paint a picture of a fascism that isn't just one giant Sauron-like evil entity in total unification with itself. In fact, it's made up of a scattering of different kinds of craven, opportunistic. You use the word complicity when you describe the book, and I think this is very much a book about complicity. It's people who are just getting along. It's people who are just making a buck. It's idealistic racists who really believe in purification. It's, Christian apocalyptic fantasists. And that muddle of different elements amalgamating into a fascism is something I should think we would look at and see ourselves in the mirror right now.
Well, 10 years ago, I think we're all students now of European fascism and its relevance to us. 10 years ago, I wasn't as interested. I knew as much as anybody knew about it. Is it your argument that this book is strangely more relevant in this moment, or do you maintain that this book has been relevant since the day it came out?
I don't think it's ever failed to be relevant, and it was a very brave and almost bizarre gesture when it was written. I think if it were, it's very typical for Philip K. Dick to be decades out ahead of subjects. He had advertisements that got up and walked around and followed you down the street and tugged on your sleeves, back when Madison Avenue was brand new. He had what he called news clowns, which was the sober texture of Walter Cronkite devolving into provocation and cynicism and sneering irony on the evening news. And in this book, he's saying American fascism is somehow encoded in the victory, the post-war consensus, the ascent of corporatism, the ascent of Madison Avenue, the kind of consensus that was built at that time contains a grain of unresolved fascist yearning.
What a remarkable take that you've got on a remarkable book. I remember when I read it, not understanding how relevant it might be. It sort of feels more relevant to me. Jonathan, great to have you here. I hope you'll come back and we'll talk about some of your books that you've written.
My pleasure.
Jonathan Lethem is the author of The Fortress of Solitude and the editor of Philip K. Dick, 4 novels of the 1960s, and it's an anthology. All right, thank you to the newest member of our Velshi Book Club, and we'll be right back.